David's tomb. When David was buried, Solomon put abundant treasures into his tomb. 1,300 years later, the high priest Hyrcanus took 1,000 talents of the money secreted there to use it in the preventing of the siege of Jerusalem by the Greek king Antiochus. King Herod also abstracted great sums, but none of the marauders could penetrate to the resting place of the king, where David and his successors were interred, for it was sunk into the earth so skillfully that it could not be found. Once upon a time, a Moslem pasha visited the mausoleum, and when he was looking into it through a window, a weapon of his, ornamented with diamonds and pearls, dropped into the tomb. A Mohammedan was dropped through the window to fetch the weapon. When he was drawn up again, he was dead, and 3 other Mohammedans who tried to enter in the same way met the same fate. At the instigation of the Khedai, the Pasha then informed the rabbi of Jerusalem that the Jews would be held responsible for the return of the weapon. The rabbi ordered a 3 days fast to be spent in prayer. Then a lottery was cast to designate the messenger who would be charged with the perilous errand of being lowered into the tomb. The lot fell on the beadle of the synagogue, a pious and upright man. He secured the weapon and returned it to the Pasha, who manifested his gratitude by kindly treatment of the Jews thereafter. The beadle later told his adventures in the tomb to the Hakam Bashai. When he had descended, there suddenly appeared before him an old man of dignified appearance, who handed him what he was seeking. Another miraculous tale concerning the tomb of David runs as follows. A poor but very pious Jewish washerwoman was once persuaded by the keeper of the tomb to enter it. Hardly was she within when the man nailed up the entrance and ran to the Khedai to inform him that a Jewess had gone in. Incensed, the Khedai hurried to the spot with the intention of having the woman burned for her presumptuousness. In her terror, the poor creature began to weep and implore God for help. Suddenly, a flood of light illuminated the dark tomb, and a venerable old man took her by the hand and led her downward under the earth until she reached the open. There he parted from her with the words, "Hurry home and let no one know that you were away from your house." The Khedai had the tomb and its surroundings thoroughly searched by his bailiffs, but not a trace of the woman could be found, although the keeper again and again swore by the prophet that the woman had entered. Now the messengers whom the Khedai had sent to the house of the woman returned and reported that they had found her washing busily, and greatly astonished at their question whether she had been at the tomb of David. The Khedai, accordingly, decided that for his false statements and for his perjury, the keeper must die the very death intended for the innocent woman, and so he was burned. The people of Jerusalem suspected a miracle, but the woman did not divulge her secret until a few hours before her death. She told her story and then bequeathed her possessions to the congregation under the condition that a scholar recite the Kodesh for her on each anniversary of her death. Solomon punishes Joab. At the youthful age of 12, Solomon succeeded his father David as king. His real name was Jedediah, the friend of God, but it was superseded by the name Solomon on account of the peace that prevailed throughout the realm during his reign. He bore 3 other names besides, Ben, Jacob, and Ithiel. He was called Ben because he was the builder of the temple, Jacob because he was the ruler of the whole world, and Ithiel because God was with him. The rebellion Adonijah intended to lead against the future king was suppressed during David's lifetime by having Solomon anointed in public. On that occasion, Solomon rode on a remarkable she-mule, remarkable because she was not the product of cross-breeding, but a special act of creation. As soon as he ascended the throne, Solomon set about executing the instructions of his father that he had given him on his deathbed. The first of them was the punishment of Joab. Notwithstanding all his excellent qualities, which fitted him not only to be David's first general, but also the president of the academy. But Joab had committed great crimes which had to be atoned for. Beside the murder of Abner and Amasa, of which he was guilty, he had incurred wrong against David himself. The generals of the army suspected him of having Uriah the Hittite put out of the way for purposes of his own, but he showed them David's letter dooming Uriah, the sin against David's trust. David might have forgiven Joab, but he wanted him to pay for his sins in this world, so that he might be exempt from punishment in the world to come. When Joab perceived that Solomon intended to have him executed, he sought the protection of the temple. He knew full well that he could not save his life in this way, for the arm of justice reaches beyond the doors of the sanctuary to the altar of God. What he wished for was to be accorded a regular trial, and not suffer death by the king's order. In the latter case, he would lose fortune as well as life, and he wanted to leave his children well provided for. Then Solomon sent word that he had no intention of confiscating his estates. Though he was convinced of Joab's guilt, Solomon did grant him the privilege of defense. The king questioned him. "Why did you kill Abner?" Joab: "I was the avenger of my brother Asahel, who Abner had killed." Solomon: "Why? It was Asahel who sought to kill Abner, and Abner acted in self-defense." Joab: "Abner might have disabled Asahel without going to extremes." Solomon: "That Abner could not do." Joab: "What? Abner aimed directly at Asahel's fifth rib, and you say he could not have managed to wound him lightly?" Solomon: "Very well then, we will drop Abner's case. But why did you slay Amasa?" Joab: "He acted rebelliously towards King David. He did not execute his order to gather an army within 3 days, and for that offense he deserved to suffer the death penalty." Solomon: "Amasa failed to obey the king's order because he had been taught by our sages that even a king's injunctions may be set aside if they involve neglect of the study of the Torah, which was the case with the order given to Amasa. And indeed," continued Solomon, "it was not Amasa, but you yourself who rebelled against the king, for you were about to join Absalom, and if you refrained, it was from fear of David's strong-fisted troops." When Joab saw that death was inevitable, he said to Benaiah, who was charged with the execution of the king's order, "Tell Solomon he cannot inflict 2 punishments on me. If he expects to take my life, he must remove the curse pronounced by David against me and my descendants on account of the slaying of Abner. If not, he cannot put me to death." Solomon realized the justice of the plea. By executing Joab, he transferred David's curse to his own posterity. Rehoboam, his son, was afflicted with an issue. Uzziah suffered with leprosy. Asa had to lean on a staff when he walked. The pious Josiah fell by the sword of Pharaoh, and Jeconiah lived off charity. So the curses of David were delivered on his own family instead of Joab's. The marriage of Solomon. The next to suffer Joab's fate was Shimei ben Gera, whose treatment of David had outraged every feeling of decency. His death was an evil omen for Solomon himself. So long as Shimei, who was Solomon's teacher, was alive, he did not venture to marry the daughter of Pharaoh. When, after Shimei's death, Solomon took her to wife, the angel Gabriel descended from heaven and inserted a reed in the sea. About this reed more and more earth was gradually deposited, and on the day on which Jeroboam erected the golden calves, a little hut was built on the island. This was the first of the dwelling places of Rome. Solomon's wedding feast in celebration of his marriage with the Egyptian princess came on the same day as the consecration of the temple. The rejoicing over the king's marriage was greater than over the completion of the temple. As the proverb has it, all pay flattery to a king. Then it was that God conceived the plan of destroying Jerusalem. It was as the prophet spoke, "This city has been a cause of my anger and my fury from the day they built it." In the nuptial night, Pharaoh's daughter had her attendants play on 1,000 different musical instruments, which she had brought with her from her home. And as each was used, the name of the idol to which it was dedicated was mentioned aloud. The better to hold the king under the spell of her charms, she spread above his bed a tapestry cover studded with diamonds and pearls, which gleamed and glittered like the constellations in the sky. Whenever Solomon wanted to rise, he saw these stars, and thinking it was still night, he slept on until the 4th hour of the morning. The people were plunged in grief, for the daily sacrifice could not be brought on the very morning of the temple dedication, because the temple keys lay under Solomon's pillow, and none dared awake him. Word was sent to Bathsheba, who then aroused her son and rebuked him for his laziness. "Your father," she said, "was well known as a God-fearing man, and now people will say, 'Solomon is the son of Bathsheba. It is his mother's fault if he goes wrong.' Whenever your father's wives were pregnant, they offered vows and prayed that a son worthy to reign might be born. But my prayer was for a learned son, worthy of the gift of prophecy. Take care, then, not to give your strength to women, nor your ways to those that destroy kings, for licentiousness confounds the reason of man. Keep well in mind the things that are necessary in the life of a king. Have nothing in common with kings who say, 'What need do we have of a god?' It is not wise if you should be like the kings who drink wine and live in lewdness. Do not be like them. He to whom the secrets of the world are revealed should not intoxicate himself with wine." Apart from having married a Gentile whose conversion to Judaism was not dictated by pure motives, Solomon transgressed 2 other biblical laws. He kept many horses, which a Jewish king ought not to do, and, what the law holds in equal abhorrence, he amassed much silver and gold. Under Solomon's rule, silver and gold were so abundant among the people that their utensils were made of them instead of the baser metals. For all this he had to atone painfully later on. His wisdom. But Solomon's wealth and pomp were nothing compared with his wisdom. When God appeared to him in Gibeon, in a dream by night, and gave him permission to ask what he would, Solomon chose wisdom, knowing that with wisdom in his possession, all else would come of itself. His wisdom, the scriptures testify, was greater than the wisdom of Ethan, the Ezrahite, and Heman, Calcol, and Darda, the 3 sons of Mahal. This means that he was wiser than Abraham, Moses, and Joseph. He excelled even Adam. His proverbs, which have come down to us, are barely 800 in number. Nevertheless, Scripture counts them equal to 3,000, for the reason that each verse of his book contains double and triple interpretations. In his wisdom, he analyzed the laws revealed to Moses, and he assigned reasons for the ritual and ceremonial ordinances of the Torah, which, without his explanation, had seemed strange. The 49 gates of wisdom were open to Solomon as they had been to Moses, but the wise king sought to outdo even the wise legislator. He had such confidence in himself that he would have dispensed justice without resort to witnesses, had he not been prevented by a heavenly voice. The first proof of his wisdom was given in his verdict in the case of the child claimed by 2 mothers as their own. When the women presented their difficulty, the king said that God, in his wisdom, had foreseen such a quarrel would arise, and therefore had created the organs of man in pairs, so that neither of the 2 parties in the dispute might be wronged if the babes were cut in half. On hearing these words from the king, Solomon's counselors lamented, "Woe to you, O Israel, when your king is a youth." In a little while, after the dispute had been solved sensibly, they realized the wisdom of the king and exclaimed, "Happy are you, O Israel, when your king is a free man." The quarrel had been brought about by God so that Solomon's wisdom might be made known. In reality, the 2 litigants, quarreling over the live baby, were not women at all but spirits. That all doubt about the fairness of the verdict might be dispelled, a heavenly voice proclaimed, "This is the mother of the child." During the lifetime of David, when Solomon was still a lad, he had settled another difficult case in an equally brilliant way. A wealthy man had sent his son on a long business trip to Africa. On his return, he found that his father had died and his treasures had passed into the possession of a crafty slave, who had succeeded in ridding himself of all the other slaves or intimidating them. In vain, the rightful heir urged his claim before King David. As he could not bring witnesses to testify for him, there was no way of disposing the slave, who likewise called himself the son of the deceased. The child Solomon heard the case, and he devised a method of arriving at the truth. He had the father's corpse exhumed, and he dyed one of the bones with the blood of one of the claimants, and then of the other. The blood of the slave showed no affinity with the bone, while the blood of the true heir permeated it. So the real son secured his inheritance. After his ascension to the throne, a peculiar quarrel among heirs was brought before Solomon for judgment. Asmodeus, the king of the demons, once said to Solomon, "You are the wisest of men, yet I shall show you something you have never seen." Then Asmodeus stuck his finger in the ground, and up came a double-headed man. He was one of the Canaanites who lived underground, and are altogether different in nature from the denizens of the upper world. When the Canaanite wanted to return to his dwelling place, it appeared that he could not. Not even Asmodeus could bring it about. So he remained on earth, took a wife, and begot 7 sons, one of whom resembled his father in having 2 heads. When the Canaanite died, a dispute broke out among his descendants as to how the property was to be divided. The double-headed son claimed 2 portions. Both Solomon and the Sanhedrin were at a loss. They could not discover a precedent to guide them. Then Solomon prayed to God, "O Lord of all, when you appeared to me in Gibeon and gave me permission to ask a gift of you, I desired neither silver nor gold, but only wisdom, that I might be able to judge men in justice. Grant me that wisdom now." God heard his prayer. When the sons of the Canaanite again came before Solomon, he poured hot water on one of the heads of the double-headed monster. Then both heads flinched, and both mouths cried out, "We are dying. We are one, not 2. Solomon decided that the double-headed son was, after all, only a single being. On another occasion, Solomon invented a lawsuit in order to elicit the truth in a complicated case. 3 men appeared before him, each of whom accused the others of theft. They had been traveling together, and when the Sabbath approached, they halted and prepared to rest, and looked for a safe hiding place for their money, for it is not allowed to carry money on the Sabbath. They all 3 together hid what they had in the same spot, and when the Sabbath was over, they hurried to the spot only to find that the money had been stolen. It was clear one of the 3 must have been the thief, but which one? Solomon said to them, "I know you to be experienced and thorough businessmen, so I would like you to help me decide a suit the king of Rome has submitted to me. In the Roman kingdom there lived a maiden and a youth, who promised each other under oath never to enter into marriage without obtaining each other's permission. The parents of the girl betrothed their daughter to a man whom she loved, but she refused to become his wife until the companion of her youth gave his consent. She took much silver and gold and sought to bribe him. Setting aside his love for the girl, he offered her and her lover congratulations and refused to accept the slightest return of the permission granted. On their way home, the happy couple were surprised by an old highwayman who was about to rob the young man of his bride and his money. The girl told the brigand the story of her life, closing with these words, "If a youth controlled his passion for me, how much more should you, an old man? You should be filled with the fear of God. Let me go my way." Her words took effect. The aged robber laid hands on neither the girl nor the money. Now, Solomon continued with the 3 litigants, "I was asked to decide which of the 3 persons concerned acted most nobly, the girl, the youth, or the highwayman, and I should like to have your views on the question." The first of the 3 said, "My praise is for the girl who kept her oath so faithfully." The second, "I should award my vote to the youth, who kept himself in check and did not permit his passion to prevail." The third said, "I commend the brigand, who kept his hands off the money, since even as he surrendered the woman, he still might have taken the money." The last answer sufficed to put Solomon on the right track. The man who was inspired with the admiration of the virtues of the robber probably was himself filled with greed of money. He had him cross-examined and finally extorted his confession. He had committed the theft and revealed the spot where he had hidden the money. Even animals submitted their controversies to Solomon's wise judgment. A man with a jug of milk came on a serpent wailing pitifully in a field. To the man's question, the serpent replied that it was tortured with thirst. "And what are you carrying in the jug?" When he heard what it was, he begged for the milk and promised to reward the man by showing him a hidden treasure. The man gave the milk to the serpent and was then led to a great rock. "Under this rock," said the serpent, "lies the treasure." The man rolled the rock aside and was about to take the treasure when suddenly the serpent made a lunge at him and coiled himself about his neck. "What do you mean by acting so?" exclaimed the man. "I am going to kill you," replied the serpent, "because you are robbing me of all my money." The man proposed that they take their case to King Solomon and obtain his decision as to who was in the wrong. So they did. Solomon asked the serpent to state what it demanded of the man. "I want to kill him," answered the serpent, "because the scriptures command it, saying, 'You shall bruise the heel of man.'" Solomon said, "First release your hold on the man's neck. In court, neither party to a lawsuit may enjoy an advantage over the other." The serpent glided to the floor, and Solomon repeated his question, and received the same answer as before from the serpent. Then Solomon turned to the man and said, "To you God's command was to bruise the head of the serpent. That is what you should have done." And the man immediately crushed the head of the serpent. Sometimes Solomon's assertions and views, though they sprang from profound wisdom, seemed strange to common men. In such cases the wise king did not disdain to illustrate the correctness of his opinions. For instance, both the learned and the ignorant were stung into opposition by Solomon saying, "One honest man among 1,000 I have found, but an honest woman among these I have not found." So Solomon pledged to prove that he was right. He had his attendants seek out a married couple enjoying a reputation for uprightness and virtue. The husband was brought before him, and Solomon told him that he had decided to appoint him to an exalted office. The king demanded only, as a token of his loyalty, that he murder his wife, so that he might be free to marry the king's daughter, a spouse comparable with the dignity of his new station. With a heavy heart the man went home. His despair grew at the sight of his fair wife and his little children. Though determined to do the king's bidding, he still lacked courage to kill his wife while she was awake. He waited until she was asleep, but then the child enfolded in the mother's arms rekindled his paternal and conjugal affection. And he replaced his sword in its sheath, saying to himself, "If the king were to offer me his whole realm, I would not murder my wife." Then he went to Solomon and told him his final decision. A month later, Solomon sent for the wife and declared his love for her. He told her that their happiness could be consummated if she would do away with her husband. Then she would be the first wife in his harem. Solomon then gave her a lead sword, which glittered as though it was fashioned of steel. The woman returned home resolved to put the sword to its appointed use. Not a quiver of her eyes betrayed her sinister purpose. On the contrary, by caresses and tender words she sought to disarm any suspicion. In the night she arose, drew forth the sword, and proceeded to kill her husband. The lead instrument naturally did no harm except to awaken her husband, to whom she had to confess her evil intent. The next day both man and wife were summoned before the king, who thus convinced his counselors of the truth, that no trust can be placed in women. The fame of Solomon's wisdom spread far and wide. Many entered the service of the king in hope of profiting by his wisdom. 3 brothers had served him for 13 years, and disappointed in not having learned anything, they made up their minds to quit his service. Solomon gave them the alternative of receiving 100 coins each or being taught 3 wise laws. They decided to take the money. They had scarcely left the town when the youngest of the 3, regardless of the protests of his 2 brothers, hurried back to Solomon and said to him, "My lord, I did not take service under you to make money. I wanted to acquire wisdom. Please take your money back and teach me wisdom instead." Solomon then imparted the following 3 rules of conduct. When you travel abroad, set out on your journey with the dawn and turn in for the night before darkness falls. Do not cross a river that is swollen, and never betray a secret to a woman. The man quickly overtook his brothers, but he confided nothing to them of what he had learned from Solomon. At the approach of the 9th hour, 3 hours after noon, they reached a suitable spot in which to spend the night. The youngest brother, mindful of Solomon's advice, proposed that they stop there. The others taunted him with his stupidity, which, they said, had begun to display itself when he carried the money back to Solomon. The two proceeded on their way, but the youngest arranged his quarters for the night. When darkness came on, and with it nipping cold, he was snug and comfortable, while his brothers were surprised by a snowstorm in which they perished. The following day he continued his journey, and on the road found the dead bodies of his brothers. Having appropriated their money, he buried them and went on. When he reached a river that was very much swollen, he remembered Solomon's advice, and delayed to cross until the flood subsided. While waiting on the bank, he observed how some of the king's servants were attempting to ford the stream with beasts laden with gold. They were washed away and drowned by the flood. After the waters abated, he crossed and appropriated the gold strapped to the drowned animals. When he returned home, wealthy and wise, he told nothing of what he had experienced even to his wife, who was very curious to find out where her husband had obtained his wealth. Finally, she plied him so closely with questions that Solomon's advice about confiding a secret to a woman was quite forgotten. Later, when his wife was quarreling with him, she cried out, "Not enough that you murdered your brothers, you want to kill me too." Then he was charged with the murder of their husbands by his two sisters-in-law. He was tried, condemned to death, and escaped the hangman only when he told Solomon the story of his life, and was recognized as his former retainer. It was with reference to this man's adventures that Solomon said, "Acquire wisdom, she is much better than gold." Another of Solomon's disciples had a similar experience. Annually, a man came a great distance to pay a visit to the wise king, and when he departed, Solomon was in the habit of bestowing him with a gift. Once the guest refused the gift and asked the king to teach him the language of birds and animals instead. The king was ready to grant his request, but first warned him of the great danger connected with such knowledge. "If you tell others a word of what you hear from an animal," he said, "you will surely suffer death. Your destruction is inevitable." Undaunted, the visitor persisted in his wish, and the king instructed him in the secret art. Back at home, he overheard a conversation between his ox and his ass. The ass said, "Brother, how fare you with these people?" The ox, "As you live, brother, I pass day and night in hard and painful toil." The ass, "I can give you relief if you follow my advice. Then you will live in comfort and will rid yourself of all hard work." The ox, "May your heart be inclined toward me, to take pity on me and help me. I promise not to depart from your advice to the right or the left." The ass, "God knows I am speaking to you in the uprightness of my heart and purity of my thoughts. My advice to you is not to eat either straw or fodder tonight. When our master notices it, he will suppose that you are sick. Then he will put no burdensome work on you, and you can take a good rest. That's what I did today." The ox followed the advice. He touched none of the food thrown to him. The master, suspecting a ruse on the part of the ass, arose during the night and went to the stable. There he watched the ass eat his fill from the manger belonging to the ox. He could not help laughing out loud, which greatly amazed his wife, who of course had noticed nothing out of the way. The master evaded her questions. Something funny had just occurred to him, he said by way of explanation. For the sly trick played on the ox, he determined to punish the ass. He ordered his servant to let the ox rest for the day, and made the ass do the work of both. That evening, the ass trudged into the stable tired and exhausted. The ox greeted him with the words, "Brother, have you heard anything of what our heartless master has in mind?" "Yes," replied the ass. "I heard them speaking of having you slaughtered if you should refuse to eat tonight. They want to make sure that at least your flesh is still good." Scarcely had the ox heard the words of the ass when he threw himself on his food like a ravenous lion on his prey. Not a speck did he leave behind, and the master was suddenly moved to uproarious laughter. This time his wife insisted on knowing the cause. In vain she entreated and supplicated. She swore not to live with him any more if he did not tell her why he laughed. The man loved her so devotedly that he was ready to sacrifice his life to satisfy her. But before taking leave of this world, he desired to see his friends and relations once more, and he invited them all to his house. Meanwhile, his dog was made aware of his master's approaching end, and such sadness took possession of the faithful beast that he touched neither food nor drink. The rooster, on the other hand, happily appropriated the food intended for the dog, and he and his wives enjoyed a banquet. Outraged by the unfeeling behavior, the dog said to the rooster, "You are impudent and have no modesty. Your master is but a step from the grave, and you eat and make merry." The rooster's reply was, "Is it my fault if our master is a fool and an idiot? I have 10 wives, and I rule them as I will. Not one of them dares oppose me in my commands. Our master has a single wife, and this one he cannot control and manage." "What should our master do?" asked the dog. "Let him take a heavy stick and belabor his wife's back thoroughly," advised the rooster. "I warrant you, she won't plague him any more to reveal his secrets." The husband had overheard this conversation too, and the rooster's advice seemed good. He followed it, and death was averted. On many occasions Solomon brought his acumen and wisdom to bear on foreign rulers who attempted to concoct mischief against him. Solomon needed help in building the temple, and he wrote to Pharaoh, asking him to send artists to Jerusalem. Pharaoh complied with his request, but not honestly. He had his astrologers determine which of his men were destined to die within the year. These candidates for the grave he sent over to Solomon. The Jewish king was not slow to discover the trick played. He immediately returned the men to Egypt, each provided with grave clothes, and wrote, "To Pharaoh, I guess you had no burial shrouds for these people. So I send you these men and what they were in need of." Hiram, king of Tyre, the steadfast friend of the dynasty of David who had done Solomon much valuable services in connection with the building of the temple, was always desirous of testing his wisdom. He was in the habit of sending catch questions and riddles to Solomon with the request that he solve them and help him out of his embarrassment about them. Solomon, of course, succeeded in answering them all. Later on, he made an agreement with Hiram that they were to exchange conundrums and riddles, and a bet of money was to be given up by the one who failed to find the proper answer to a question proposed by the other. Naturally, it was Hiram who was always the loser. The Tyrians maintain that finally Solomon found his match in one of Hiram's subjects, Abdamon, who put many a riddle to Solomon that baffled his wit. Of Solomon's subtlety in riddle guessing, only a few instances have come down to us, all of them connected with riddles put to him by the Queen of Sheba. The story of this queen, of her relation to Solomon, and what induced her to leave her distant home and journey to the court at Jerusalem, forms an interesting chapter in the eventful life of the wise king. Next, the Queen of Sheba. End part 80 of 95, TheLegendsOfTheJews.com.